Did Jesus abolish the distinction between clean and unclean food in the law of Moses? Many say that he did based on his interaction with the Pharisees in Mark 7. In this passage, Jesus says that nothing that goes into a person can defile him. Also, in most English Bible translations, Mark 7:19 has a parenthetical statement that reads, "Thus he declared all foods clean." Hence, Jesus abolished the Torah's food laws, or so the argument goes. But is that really what this passage is saying? My guest today, Dr. Logan Williams, challenges this antinomian reading of Mark 7 and offers a more plausible interpretation. Dr. Williams recently wrote a paper on this passage that was published in the academic journal New Testament Studies put out by Cambridge, and I'm honored to have him join me to discuss his paper. So let's dive in. Dr. Williams, how are you doing?
Great.
Great. Well, it's glad to have you with us. And before we get into the topic today, would you mind introducing yourself and what you do?
Yeah, so I currently am a research fellow at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, and I work on the New Testament and Jewish law for my research. And one of the things that fascinates me is the question of law observance or lack thereof, question mark, in the Gospels, which gives rise to this paper that we're talking about today.
Excellent. And how did you get interested in scholarship and researching the New Testament?
Yeah, so I started as a jazz guitar major in my undergraduate years in LA. And I love music, but I didn't enjoy the degree, the way it was structured. And I thought, you know what, I can do what I want to do with music some other ways. And I was taking some classes on like Bible survey classes and really enjoyed them, and thought, you know what, I will switch to this, doing a major in this because I like it and I enjoy it, and I'm not as motivated to do all my other the things I should be doing for my guitar major. So I might as well just give in to my interests and switch to this other thing. And then I kind of just was like, oh, I really like this. Took some languages, got acquainted with a bunch of texts and scholarship, and just kind of enjoyed it more and more, and just somehow ended up making a career out of it. And so, yeah, I kind of feel like I've stumbled upon it just kind of through being interested. But I'm really glad I get to have the opportunities to do what I get to do and to research and read and write. And yeah, I love it. So.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've really benefited from reading your material that you've put out and your scholarship. You're certainly one of my favorite followers on our follows on X, formerly Twitter.
Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, I really appreciate your work. And yeah, and music. That's interesting. I actually before I got interested in studying the Bible, obviously I'm not a scholar yet. I'm just got my undergrad, and I'm gonna be working on my master's soon. But I was, yeah. But I was in a Christian screamo band, so
yes, I love it. What was the name?
Organ of Cordy.
Yeah,
it's the organ in your ear that turns vibration into sound. And so our thinking, awesome. Yeah, our thinking behind the name was like, you know, we take the gospel and put it in a form that kids can understand today. So Organ of Cordy, that was kind of the logic behind it. But yeah, it was fun. But yeah, I really appreciate your work. And you recently wrote a paper that we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah.
On Jesus's interaction with the Pharisees in Mark 7 concerning ritual hand washing. And I think I read somewhere that you won an award for your work on this passage. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I won what's called the Ochtmeyer Award for New Testament Scholarship. And it's an annual award from SBL it's kind of like a best paper competition. Anything that's not been published or accepted by a journal. And I think you have to be within 10 years of finishing your PhD or something. So it's designed for a kind of award for an early career researcher. And this was actually, funnily enough, the kind of thing that really got me into questions of ritual law was back during the pandemic. I was reading Mark in Greek, and I came across Mark 7:19c, and I looked at my English translations, and I was like, no way that's right. And then it just kind of sucked me into these questions of Jewish law. Took a few years to write this paper and submitted it for the competition, and yeah, won it. Got to present on it with respondents at Society of Biblical Literature in 2022. Yeah, November 2022. And since then, in between when it won the award and when I presented it, it got accepted to the journal New Testament Studies, and now it's out finally.
That's awesome. Yeah. I'm really excited for people to read it, and and for us to talk about it a little later today. You're going to kind of talk about the Greek behind that passage or that verse in verse 19. So, so although this passage, or really the Gospels, have traditionally been understood to be portraying Jesus as disregarding the Torah's food laws and other ritual commandments in the law, you mentioned in your paper that there has been kind of a steady shift in scholarly consensus regarding this topic. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So in the past century, I'd say, we've kind of seen this steady chorus of voices emerging on various different kind of topics in the Gospels, where people take a passage that maybe used to look like Jesus was just disregarding something about the Torah, and then some people go, actually, no, I don't think that's the case. And that's kind of had this cascading effect where, maybe if I'm getting my kind of dates right, or if I'm thinking in generalist scholarship right, or let's imagine the situation, right? Some people kind of start saying, well, maybe the Sabbath scene in Mark 2 about, plucking grains and Sabbath, maybe that isn't really just him saying Sabbath doesn't matter, right? But then, then you keep going, and then other people might say that same thing about the temple, right? Well, maybe actually Jesus didn't think the temple should just be, done away with or whatever, right? And so this has kind of been this cascading effect in scholarship. And one of the most recent developments has been people focusing on how Jesus didn't disregard ritual purity laws. So the laws pertaining to leprosy and dead bodies and menstruation and seminal emissions and all these laws, basically laws of Leviticus 12 through 15 and Numbers 19. So people like Paula Fredrickson, Cecilia Wasson, Matt Thiessen, John Van Maren, and others have more recently suggested, this is one of these other things that we might think Jesus was disregarding, but actually, when we look closely, it looks like he's not. So this kind of had this cascading effect, and one of the things that's emerged in this kind of wave of scholarship is that people have realized, well, if we don't see Jesus doing, disregarding the Torah elsewhere, and if he seems to quite explicitly uphold the Torah, right, in Mark 1, where he says, go and do what Moses commanded, or when he says to the Pharisees, the reason why your tradition sucks is because it makes you not obey the law of Moses, or in Matthew, when he says, you should actually do what the Pharisees tell you, just don't do what they do. Or elsewhere in Matthew, where he says, I've came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, right? So all of these kind of other evidences make it really unlikely that the gospel writers would also just say, oh yeah, but Jesus just said, food laws are no more, right? So this has caused a pressure to reinterpret something like Mark 7. And especially that phrase that's usually translated as purifying all foods. And we can get into in a bit, how people deal with that in different ways, but this is kind of generally like the pressure from other texts in the Gospels that have been recently reread over the past few decades have pressured also scholars to revisit Mark 7 and propose different theories about what it may or may not mean.
That's awesome. Yeah, I noticed that there's kind of a movement within Pauline scholarship as well, like the Paul within Judaism perspective that has been kind of gaining influence. And so, yeah, it's fascinating to see some of these moves in scholarship. So can you maybe set up the context for Mark 7 for us? What's going on what's going on in this passage? What are the primary aspects of this passage that have traditionally led some to believe that Jesus rejects the Torah's food laws?
Yeah, so two things in there. One is what's the context, what's going on, and then two, why do they right? Why is this antinomian conclusion really popular? So the first, regarding context, it seems to be apparently that the Pharisees and some scribes who apparently coming from Jerusalem are either witnessing Jesus and his disciples dine, but more likely they're actually dining. They're all dining together, probably. In what context would you see somebody eat? Probably if you were also eating in a house, right? So they appear to be all dining together. This is actually on par, with what Jesus does elsewhere. He dines with Pharisees, right? He dines with Simon and Luke, right? So he's dining with the Pharisees and scribes, and the scribes see that Jesus' disciples, not Jesus himself, mind you, but some of Jesus' disciples are not immersing their hands, ritually washing their hands before they eat. And what they ask is really important. They do not ask, why are you breaking the law? Or why are you disregarding what Moses commanded? They say, why do you not walk according to the tradition of the elders? So this is really important to set the scene. No one's accusing the disciples of sinning. No one's accusing them of abandoning a commandment, right? Now, it's not as if abandoning the tradition is nothing, but the Pharisees and the scribes are very acutely aware that the question they're asking is a lower stakes than something like in Mark 2, right? Which is the plucking grains on the Sabbath. Why are you doing what is not lawful, right? That's a bigger accusation, right? This is more of a kind of like, hey, why don't you accept the tradition? Because we know from other sources that not all Jews accepted the tradition, right? The Sadducees famously rejected the tradition. So similarly, not all of Jesus' disciples are accepting the tradition. So they ask, why are you doing this? And Mark then adds this parenthetical comment about Jewish ritual washing practices. But the main point is that apparently it was a decision or something that was passed on from these elders that prior to ingesting what's called chulin, or later in rabbinic tradition called chulin, which is non-special food, just normal food, right? Not non-kosher food, right? Just normal food, like not tithes food or holy food or the bread of presence or whatever, or second tithe or whatever. Just normal food that you eat, right? That you would still have to wash your hands before that. But notably, that commandment, not in Torah, right? Or more accurately, is not a commandment. It is not a commandment to wash your hands before you eat. It's not a commandment to eat your food in a state of ritual purity. So you don't have to immerse before eating in order to follow Torah. Now you would if you were a priest, but if you're a normal person eating chulin outside the temple, right, you don't have to do that. And so this, I'll add that this maps onto a universal understanding. Maybe there's some quibbles here and there, but not ones that seem to have gained much traction. A kind of universal recognition across the variegated rabbinic tradition, both in the Tannaitic sources, that's the earlier layer, and the Amoraic sources, that's the later set of rabbis, that though we do wash our hands before eating, this is not a commandment in Scripture. That would be called deoraita, a commandment from Scripture. But this is rather a decree de rabbanan, a decree of the elders or the rabbis or the sages, de rabbanan of the rabbis. And so even well afterwards, right, in Jewish tradition, there's a recognition that we do this is regular, but we understand that if we don't do it, it's not disobeying a commandment in written Torah. Right. So the Pharisaic distinction is something that's carried on through Jewish tradition for centuries, even till today. So that's the first thing, context, right? Sorry, it's very long-winded, but now the second thing is that Jesus responds to this in two ways, right? So he says, why don't you follow the tradition? And his first response is to pivot and say, well, other parts of your tradition suck. So he says, okay, well, you have this ruling about, certain prohibitive vows, Corban vows, which we won't get into, where you are holding to your traditional ruling that's passed down to you in your tradition. You're ruling on this certain case, issue of case law, which leads people to disobey the fifth commandment, disobey honor your father and mother. And so he says, the reason I don't wash my hands is because the rest of your tradition has stupid stuff in it, which I think is a funny pivot. And also a pretty like serious, like, right? They're like, hey, why don't you follow the tradition? He's like, because you are all disobedient, right? Like it just really, 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 really like escalates. They're like, dude, we're just eating dinner here, and I was just curious, but all right. Now one thing to note there, which is really important, is Jesus is mad at the Pharisees not for caring too much about Torah,
right?
Not because they're obsessed with minutia and strictness, which are two different things, I might add, but that's another conversation. He's mad at them because by holding fast to their tradition, they disregard the commandment of God. Right. So we need to establish a prima facie case here, right? If that's his criticism of the Pharisees, if he's about to turn around and say, by the way, Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14 regarding kosher laws, let's just throw those out the window.
Right.
This would be massively hypocritical, right? Now, what I find ironic is that a number of scholars actually acknowledge this, but then they're like, oh yeah, but Mark's just inconsistent, whatever. I think we have to read with charity here, right? Like that kind of glaring inconsistency should make us wonder, is the problem with Mark or us?
Right.
And I think the problem is probably with us. Now, people can argue otherwise, but that's I think, a kind of charitable read is that actually we're not understanding it. Right. Okay, so now actually on to the second question. Why do people think that this is disregarding food laws? Well, in Leviticus 11, 39, and 40, it says, Leviticus 11, not all of it, but significant parts of it, list animals that are prohibited to eat. And it uses the language of tameh to describe some of these animals that are prohibited to eat. Tameh meaning impure or unclean. And then at the end of the passage, it says, Al tishaksu et nafshotechem, don't, abominate your souls with them. And then it says, v'nitmetem bam, so to make yourselves impure by them. Don't eat them so as to make yourselves impure by them. So that might seem to, to readers that are just kind of coming at it without any kind of context that, well, eating prohibited animals defiles you. So then when Jesus says nothing going into a person from outside is able to defile them, we see that as saying, well, all of Leviticus 11 is basically done away with now. That's it. It seems to be, on the face of it, a direct contradiction of Leviticus 11. Now, I don't think this is the case, which we can talk about in a moment. But that's the kind of initial reaction that a lot of readers have. Leviticus 11, 39 through 40 says, don't become defiled by them. Jesus says nothing at all going into someone can defile them. And thus, away does Leviticus 11. Now, of course, what's happening here is that Jesus is making a generic statement to address a specific issue. The question is, how far-reaching is that statement? Right? Does that statement focus on food that has been defiled by unwashed hands,
right,
only, or does it also extend to something like the laws of kashrut? So yeah, that's the. Oh, let me add one thing to the context as well. The apparent concern with hand washing was that it would probably just be wise to avoid becoming impure by ingestion. Now, the Torah never indicates that you can become impure by eating something that has contracted impurity from another object. So that's nowhere described in Torah. There's no situation where I touch a dead body, or let's say I throw a dead body on a bunch of apples, and then I eat those apples, right? There's no instance in which that says, and therefore you will be impure, right? But according to the Tannaitic tradition, the rabbinic tradition, and afterwards, they said, well, okay, that's not in Torah, but the elders did decree that this was a way you could become impure. And thus, it's probably just a wise thing to avoid impurity if you can. It's not a sin to contract it in most instances. It's a sin if you're, contract certain impurities as the high priest. It's a sin if you prolong the contraction of impurity and don't go through the relevant washings to ameliorate and processes to ameliorate it. But it wasn't a sin to contract impurity, right? So I think the elders are probably just ruling, well, if we can avoid it, let's avoid it. So let's just rule that we just generally do this to avoid it.
Awesome. Well, yeah. Well, thanks for setting that up for us. Yeah, there's one thing you said, not to go on too much of a rabbit trail, but this common.
I love rabbit trails. Let's do it. Yeah.
But this common assumption that Jesus's primary gripe with the Pharisees was that they were just too devoted to the law, and
exactly the opposite.
Yeah, it's really funny. That's like I think of Matthew 5:20, right, where he says, "Your righteousness must surpass the scribes and the Pharisees." And
exactly.
And the idea is that, well, the scribes and Pharisees aren't very righteous. So if your righteousness is only as good as theirs, you're not even going to be able to be in the kingdom. And so
they're universal. The Pharisees are universal when they are critiqued. Mm-hmm. The main critique that's lodged against them is they're too lenient.
Right.
From 4QMT in Qumran all the way to Mishnah Yadayim, they're critiqued for having a certain interpretation of the law that is too easy. Mm-hmm. Now that sounds wild to us, if you're us being me, someone who's in the Protestant tradition, right? Mm-hmm. But if you look closely, you can see, in the text themselves, that Jesus is making a very similar critique, right? You're doing things that allow people to get out of jail free, right? You're saying that it's okay to have this weird prohibitive vow that then exempts you from obeying the fifth commandment. Right. That's leniency.
Yeah.
Or at least not according to Jesus, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You're not devoted to the law enough. Like you need to be more devoted to the law.
Yeah.
That's really good.
Or you need to, you need to abide by a more stringent and accurate, in his mind, interpretation.
Right. Yeah. Right. Amen. Well, all right. So you said you brought up Mark 7:15 and 18 when Jesus says this interesting statement. He says, "Nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him."
Yeah.
And you mentioned that many, at face value, they look at this verse and they see this as Jesus invalidating the Torah's food laws. It seems at face value to be a direct contradiction to what Leviticus 11 states.
Yep.
But you mention, again, that a growing number of scholars challenge this reading. And can you explain the meaning of these verses and how, according to your perspective, they don't, in fact, abolish the food laws?
Yeah, so to do that, we kind of have to first look at how we should think about Leviticus 11. So one of the things we have to remember or realize is that the law affords itself to lots of different kinds of interpretations. And Jesus is already embedded in an interpretive tradition, which assumes a lot of things about how to read the Torah, which often aren't explicated for us in the Gospels because they're just assumptions. Mm-hmm. So for example, right, you get Mark, the Gospel of Mark assumes you understand what Shabbat law is, right? He's plucking grains and people say, why are you doing what's not lawful? How are you supposed to know that? Because you already know that Exodus says, don't harvest. And plucking grains could have been understood as harvesting. And therefore you're breaking Shabbat, which is a serious offense. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of assumed encyclopedic knowledge of not only what the Torah says, but also a specific way or the specific ways that people might be reading it. Now, there are certain things, lots of things, amongst early Jews that are up for dispute, right? In terms of how you interpret X and Y, right? This is why we have the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Essenes, right? And we have all these different groups precisely because these texts afford themselves to different forms of interpretation. So there are lots of points of dispute. Mm-hmm. And one that doesn't appear to be in dispute is how to understand what is, or the relationship between impurity and the laws of kashrut as embedded in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. Now, kashrut is a shorthand way of saying the laws of permitted and prohibited animals. Now, note that I didn't say laws of clean and unclean animals, because I want to be really specific here, but laws of animals that you're permitted to eat, animals that you're prohibited to eat, which are outlined in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. Not the entire chapter, but significant parts of those chapters. Mm-hmm. There seems to be, from very, very early on in Jewish tradition, a distinction between what we in scholarship call ritual purity and the laws of kashrut. Ritual impurity no, this is a relatively new term that was, I believe it was coined by Jonathan Clowens in the 90s. Before that, it was called Levitical impurity, or people refer to it as Levitical impurity. Ritual impurity is the kind of impurity that you can transfer to another person or transfer to certain objects. So these laws are mostly inscribed in Leviticus 12 through 15 and Numbers 19. So, for example, if a menstruating woman sits on a couch, or if a man with a abnormal flow of from his penis spits on you, right? You can transfer impurity to other people and objects. If you touch a dead body, if you're in the same if you're under the same roof as a dead body, you become impure, as does everything else in the house that's susceptible to impurity. So this is what scholars call ritual impurity, and it seems to be the case that from very very early on, Jewish interpreters did not think that Leviticus 11 existed within that legal category
of ritual purity.
Of ritual impurity. So the kind of impurity that can be transferred to another person. Now, this may seem really counterintuitive because the animals in Leviticus 11 are called tameh, they're called unclean. And then at the end of the chapter, it says, velo nitmei tem bam, don't become impure by them. I.e., don't eat them and so become impure by them. And so it may seem that what's happening is you, if you eat an impure animal, are acquiring the impurity of that animal, and thus you have to go through some kind of ritual to ameliorate the impurity that you have contracted. One of the important things about ritual impurity is that it's never permanent. So you can always ameliorate yourself of it by washing or going through what's called the red heifer ritual, according to Numbers 19, and waiting a certain amount of time.
Right. Is there are there ritual washings prescribed for when you eat unclean animals?
This is precisely why early Jews did not conclude, in my opinion, precisely why they did not conclude that eating an unclean animal ritually defiles you, because though it says do not make yourself impure by them, by eating them, it does not indicate any kind of way of relieving that impurity. This doesn't say, and therefore you must wash and be unclean till evening, which it says later about some other things which we'll talk about. Or it doesn't say, go through this ritual, whatever, right? So how Jews were understanding that was that it just meant don't, do something wrong. This is prohibited, not because they have some capacity to transfer some contagion to you, but just because God says, don't do it. Right now, there are other kind of like Philo and Letter of Aristeos have some theories about why that is. But curiously, right, when Philo and Letter of Aristeos, these are ancient Jewish texts from the Second Temple period written in Greek, when they get to the sections about unclean and clean animals in Leviticus 11, they come up with all these elaborate theories about why God prohibited these animals. They never say, oh, because of course they transmit impurity to you.
Wow. So
this means that from the early Second Temple period, we see that just Jews aren't even considering it a live option to read Leviticus 11 that way. And similarly, in the Mishnah, one of our earliest rabbinic Jewish texts from a few centuries, from the second, third century, in the whole massive tract or seder order on ritual impurity called Toharot, nothing about Leviticus 11.
Wow.
At all. If there's not even a dispute, right? And so the fact that there's no one who even says like, hey, by the way, one rabbi says, is Leviticus, can eating a prohibited animal defile you? And then another rabbi says, no, don't think that. Not even a recorded dispute, just never in there. So that means that from a very, very early period, this is how Jews were reading Leviticus 11, 39 through 40, or just Leviticus 11 as a whole. They weren't including it in as a kind of form of ritual impurity by eating, and therefore we can assume, for all intents and purposes, that we should probably proceed with the assumption, unless otherwise noted, that Jesus assumed this as well. And once we do that, it makes sense of the passage quite a bit, because even though our translations say nothing that goes into a person is able to defile them, it's actually a very specific Greek word that's used there that is not used anywhere in the Torah, in the Greek version of the Torah, to talk about what happens with animals, right? Or even ritual impurity in general. It's the word koinao. Now, this word, in its base form, means to cause to be shared. To cause something to be shared, or to share something, but mostly to cause something to be shared. Now, if you're thinking, it's the same word, the adjectival form is used when it says the Pharisees and scribes saw that the disciples were eating with, depending on your translation, defiled hands, common hands, impure hands, right, unwashed, and then it glosses it as unwashed. But what this essentially means is when you cause an object to be shared, it means that you cause that object to take on the ritual impurity of something else, right? So a dead body, as Hebrews says, defiles the people who touch it, right? We have the word koinao in respect to dead bodies in Hebrews. Because a dead body touches an object, it causes that object to be shared in a specific sense in its impurity. Now, this language also appears in Hebrew in a different form in the Mishnah, in a kind of developed form, but we won't get into that. Yeah, so that means that when Jesus says nothing is able to defile you, we have to understand the specificity of this. It really means nothing is able to transmit impurity through ingestion. Now, if we're talking about the transmission of impurity, we're talking about not kashrut. We're talking about ritual impurity. We're not talking about Leviticus 11. We're talking about Leviticus 12 through 15 and Numbers 19, which, curiously, those texts never outline any possibility of ingesting an object that has acquired ritual impurity from something else and then becoming impure by it. So there are two exceptions, or possible exceptions to this, which is Leviticus 17:15 and Leviticus 22:8. Leviticus 17:15 says, all persons, citizens or aliens, who eat what dies of itself or has been torn by wild animals shall wash their clothes, bathe themselves in water, and be unclean until the evening. Then they shall be clean. Now that appears to indicate that if you eat the carcass of an unclean, of a certain animal, then you become impure. Now, again, though, we have to look at how Jews assumed, or how early Jews were thinking, what early Jews thought about this text. And what we see from the very early evidence is a couple things. One, in the early Tanaim, in the very early rabbinic sources from, again, a couple centuries after Jesus, that was understood, that verse, Leviticus 17:15, was understood to refer specifically to the carcass of a permitted bird. So this is weird, right? If you eat Leviticus 17 is not talking about prohibited animals. It's saying if you eat a permitted animal, and specifically a permitted bird that has died of itself or has been torn by wild animals, if you eat it, then you become unclean. But they say you only become unclean when it's in your esophagus. Now, this is very curious because it's a very kind of specific, very curious reading of this verse. And then similarly, you would say the same for Leviticus 22:8, which says, or they would say the same for Leviticus 22:8, which says that which died of itself, that which died or was torn by wild animals, he shall not eat. He's talking about priests becoming unclean by it. I'm the Lord.
Right.
So this is already a limited thing, right? Already it's the case that eating any kind of prohibited animal doesn't defile you, which is very weird. So those same broadly set of rabbis broadly understood as the Tanaim also go back to Leviticus 11:38, which says, if an animal, it's the word behema in Hebrew, if an animal of which you may eat dies, as in a permitted animal, an animal of which you may eat dies, anyone who touches its carcass shall be unclean until the evening. Those who eat of its carcass shall wash their clothes and be unclean until the evening. So again, someone may read Leviticus 11:38 and go, oh, look, if you eat a permitted beast, that's a quadruped, behema. If you eat a permitted quadruped, then you become unclean. If you touch it, you're unclean, and then if you eat it, you're unclean. But again, one of the weird things, or maybe perhaps counterintuitive things that the early rabbis say is, they ask, why does it talk about eating? They go, okay, it talks about eating because eating establishes the minimum requirement for how much you must, a certain amount of food that enables you to be defiled by touch. So they say this verse is only talking about defilement by touch, and the eating thing is only brought in to talk about how much volume you need, how much of the carcass you need to touch in order to legitimately become impure, right? If you touch like a tiny bit of it, you won't become impure. But if you touch I believe it's an olive's bulk here, then you become impure. And because the olive's bulk is the minimum legal threshold for what's considered eating in this text, then therefore it's only about touching. Now, I don't exactly know why they ruled this. I have some theories. But again, this is one of these assumptions that seems to be not in dispute. It's just, they just go, this is how we read it. Okay, so then similarly, they go, okay, so any quadruped you eat, if it dies of itself, can't make you unclean. It can only make you unclean through touching. Even though it mentions eating here, but it's not mentioning eating because it's mentioning eating on the basis of touching. Then if you go to Leviticus 17:15, they go, okay, this is only talking about the carcass of a permitted bird, not a carcass of a permitted quadruped or anything else. And it does defile by eating, but only in the esophagus. And the same with Leviticus 22:8. And it has to be a permitted bird. Now, this is all very creative and wild. But what we can hypothesize is that if Jesus is saying nothing that goes in to a person from outside is able to cause it to share its impurity with that person, then it's most likely the case that Jesus read Leviticus 17:15 and 22:8 the same way the early rabbis are reading Leviticus 11:38, which is that this is talking about defilement by touch, not by ingestion. And there are a couple other scholars like Yair Furstenberg who have outlined similar possibilities. I critique him a little bit, but I'm broadly on board with what he says there. That probably these texts being ambiguous could be easily read as indicating defilement by touch and not by ingestion. And we see in the early rabbinic literature that the rabbis really struggle with why is it the case in Leviticus 17:15 if you eat the carcass of an impure bird you have to wash your clothes? When does it make your clothes impure? And they go through all these different interpretations. Maybe it makes you impure in the stomach. No, it can't do that because obviously stomach purifies all foods is what they assume, so it can't do that. Okay, maybe it defiles then, and then okay, well actually we're going to say it defiles in the esophagus. Now, if the early rabbis are struggling with why the carcass of a clean bird defiles when you eat it, it's really not that hard to imagine that someone might say it doesn't defile when you eat it. It defiles when you touch it. That's why you have to clean. That's why you have to wash your clothes, right? In the same way that you read Leviticus 11:38, which you think is about, if I'm dialing with the rabbis, right, which they think is about the touching of a behemah, a touching of a permitted animal, a permitted quadruped, and not the ingestion of it. So we see that these verses are in dispute. So again, we have to kind of think about the principle of charity, right? If we assume that Mark isn't blatantly contradicting himself, can we think of a situation in which Jesus' statement is sensible not within what we assume he must say, but what he himself says, which is that Jesus thinks that Moses should be obeyed, right? So if Jesus himself says that, then within Mark's framework, we need to establish some kind of coherence, right? So this is what I think, if I'm kind of imagining, right? How do we make Mark coherent? Well, probably this is how these verses in Leviticus 11, Leviticus 17, and Leviticus 22 must have been understood. So if we assume that maybe it's likely that Jesus read the carcass passages this way, Leviticus 11:38, Leviticus 17:15, and Leviticus 22:8, then we're left with a statement: nothing that goes into a person is able to share its impurity with that person. And that seems like a perfectly reasonable description of what's in Torah, because as mentioned, there is no example of impurity being transmitted to an object, let alone food, and then someone becoming impure by ingesting it. It's never in the Torah, right? So Jesus's rejection of the tradition, which is represented as a tradition which says you can become impure by eating ritually defiled objects. Right. Jesus' rejection of that is about his conservative commitment to Torah. It doesn't ever say this in Torah, so you can't. So therefore, your ruling is illegitimate, right? That's his. He has a kind of more Sadducean take on some of these, at least in Mark, of these traditions. And again, this universally aligns with the rabbinic interpretation, which says that food that has acquired impurity from elsewhere, if it defiles you, it only defiles you by rabbinic decree. It does not defile you according to the Torah. It defiles you. That the rabbis said that defiles you. And this is very clear. We'll get into it later in a statement from, actually, we can get into it now. So curiously, there's an amazing statement from Rashi in his commentary on the Babylonian Talmud tractate on Shabbat. This is Shabbat 13b, where he says, I'll just read it real quick. According to the Torah, min haTorah, from the Torah, there is no food that defiles a human who eats it, except the carcass of a permitted bird. And even less so, food defiled by touching a primary source of impurity. But the rabbis decreed this rule. So he said, from the Torah, nothing about eating food that defiles you. Only exception is the carcass of a clean bird, which we've established is a contested verse, right? Which is something that rabbis struggled with, right? So it could have afforded different interpretations. But they say, look, Rashi says, look, the only way that food can defile you, even though it's not in the Torah, the rabbis decreed this, right? So if Jesus is rejecting the tradition of the elders, which is not exactly the same as what Rashi is talking about, but we can probably, they're good things, right? If he's rejecting the tradition, then from the Torah, no food that you eat can defile you, including, for Jesus, in Jesus' interpretation, probably the carcass of a clean bird. And so his statement, nothing that goes into a person is able to defile them, is a straightforward, correct assertion about what is and what is not in the Torah.
Yep.
Assuming Jesus read some of these verses in some ways.
Yeah, very fascinating. So there's another verse that people often point to, and you spend quite a lot of time going through this verse and the Greek of this verse. As I mentioned at the beginning, Mark 7:19, most English translations have something like, thus he declared all foods clean. And they attribute this saying to the gospel writer who is interpreting Jesus's teaching. That's why it's usually like a parenthetical statement in the verse. However, you reject this reading on the basis of the Greek grammar. Yeah. And I guess this was kind of what set you on this journey, right? Of really getting into this passage. So can you give your reading of this verse and explain why your reading makes the most sense of the Greek grammar? Yeah. So let me say that first, that in the earlier tradition of interpretation, which the traditions of interpretation that use what's called the textus receptus, or the received text, or generally a Byzantine text type. There's a slight manuscript difference that makes translations different. So if you go back and look at the KJV, that phrase says, do you not know that nothing goes into a person can defile them, because it enters not into the heart but into the stomach and is cast out into the latrine. And then the KJV says, thus purging all meats. Right. So why do they say that? Yeah, it's a continuation of Jesus's words. Exactly. Yeah. Now that depends upon a certain manuscript tradition where the katharizon is in the neuter, is a neuter participle. We won't get too much into the grammar, but that would be a fair rendering of that participle, of that final phrase as it appears in that manuscript tradition. And that's purifying. Now, that participle is purifying. Right? So I think, so it's a word for purify. I think the KJV probably thinks it means expel. I'm not entirely sure, but there's an early the tradition, the kind of tradition that arises around that time, and it kind of is prevalent among the kind of early modern interpreters. It's something like, it doesn't defile you because you expel it anyways. So they don't take it to mean like purifying in the like ritual sense. Right. Now, fast forward a couple hundred years, modern text criticism becomes this crazy discipline, right? Where people start comparing manuscripts and start reconstructing new, versions of the New Testament that are more accurate to the original. And one of the decisions, which I think is right, is to prefer the masculine participle version of that phrase, which doesn't say katharizon, pantatabromata, which is the neuter, and thus would render something like the KJV, but katharizon, pantatabromata, which is a masculine participle. Now, all that
technical terms aside, why that's awkward is that it's really hard to understand why this participle would be a masculine participle, because there isn't really another noun that it can easily latch onto. Won't get into the technical aspects of the grammar. If you're interested, you can read the piece. But there are reasons why it's really difficult to figure out what exactly that's doing. And so one of the kind of conclusion that scholars came to, once we prefer that reading of the manuscript tradition, scholars think, well, the best option is to go all the way back to the phrase, he said.
Right.
And that gives us a masculine noun that this participle can latch onto, because a participle has to kind of get its subject from somewhere else.
Right.
Or has to latch onto another verb. That's the most sensible verb to these scholars that it could latch onto.
And that's at the beginning of verse 18, right?
Yes. He said, do you not know, blah, 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 blah. Mm-hmm. But now think about this. This creates a really awkward situation, right? Mm-hmm. We need to remember that though the phrase, thus he declared all foods clean, is a full sentence in our English Bibles, it's not a complete sentence in the Greek. It's just, thus cleansing all foods. Mm-hmm. So if I said this, thus he said, do you not know that nothing that goes into a person is able to defile them, because it goes not into the heart but into the stomach, and it's cast out in the latrine, it's cast out into the latrine, thus purifying all foods. But when I say thus purifying all foods, I'm referring back to he. It's not obvious if you say it like that. Right. Now, comparing to English is a really dangerous thing. But I think there's an analogy to be had here, right? There's no other analogy to this in Mark, where he'll say, Jesus said this, and then directly quote him, and then we'll add this kind of parenthetical participle at the end, which goes all the way back to the he said. I mean, it's just like it. I mean, Mark's grammar is kind of awkward to someone who's used to some more pristine Greek. Mm-hmm. Pristine Greek, right? The Greek of the educated people, like Philo or Luke or something, right? Mm-hmm. So some people might say, okay, it's awkward, but probably, and I just think it doesn't work. And let's just taking the grammar aside, setting the grammar aside, let's just think about this, okay? Jesus says the reason something that can't defile you is because it doesn't go into the heart but into the stomach, and then is cast out. Okay. So we have a couple options for, if we take thus he declared all foods clean, we have a couple options for what this means. Either he's saying from now on, all food is permitted, right? Maybe back in the day it wasn't permitted. From now on, now that I've said this, you can now, or now that I've come, or now that I've done, I've come to earth or whatever, now you can do it. Okay, that makes nonsense of Jesus' own explanation, which is not the reason that something can't defile you is because I say so. He says the reason something can't defile you is because it goes not into the heart but into the stomach. Right? Okay, so we had to just throw that out, right? If Jesus is saying because I said so, or because I have now arrived, or because I'm gonna die and resurrect, and that's gonna abolish the law or something, then that doesn't make sense of literally what he says, right? Uh-huh. The other option is this is what he portrays this as, a universal truth about the human digestive system, right? A universal truth. Nothing at any time in the past or in the future could something defile you, because your bodies are like this. So that the other option is that it never was the case that anything defiled you. Now, if we're going with the antinomian interpretation, then that means that it never was the case that Leviticus 11 was something that you should obey. Which is like, how does then that square with the rest of the passage where he's critiquing the Pharisees for
breaking the commandment,
undermining the Torah, right? Mm-hmm. So this doesn't work, right? Now, some of the early Christians try to do this like amazing gymnastics thing where they're like, oh, Leviticus 11 actually from the beginning was allegorical and you never were meant to obey it. And I'm like, yeah, okay. This is too much gymnastics for me to believe that this is what's kind of assumed or what's going on, right, in Jesus' argument. So I think we can just, right, those are our kind of major two options if we think that this is talking about the effect of Jesus' speech. And also, it doesn't make sense. Well, I have one more thing. Jesus doesn't say in this passage that, or the explanation that he provides doesn't indicate that that no food can contract impurity, right?
Mm-hmm.
He just says, if you eat it, it goes on into the heart and the stomach, and thus is cast out, right? So to then say, from that statement, it means that all food is now cleansed. It, like, what a non sequitur, right?
Right.
Like if I say this, mushroom that is poisonous to dogs is not going to hurt you because of your stomach, it doesn't mean it's not poisonous to dogs. It doesn't mean that I'm saying anything about the property of that mushroom is changed. I'm saying your body works in a certain way that it won't affect you. So it wouldn't mean to say that thus mushrooms have no poison in them for anyone, right? Like that's the kind of the effect or something. That was kind of a bad analogy, but we'll roll with it. So I think the better option is, and I don't know anyone else who's said this, though people have hinted towards certain possibilities, is that it is admittedly a kind of awkward grammatical construction, but we do actually have evidence for it in the Septuagint. And if you're interested, you can look at the examples I give in the Septuagint, where the implied agent of what's going on in a certain scene, that is what the masculine participle can latch onto. So what's happening in the scene, right? Something goes in to an anthropos, to a person. Now note that word anthropos is masculine and singular in the Greek. That's there, right? Nothing that goes into an anthropos is able to defile him or them. It's talking about all humans here. But in the pronoun there is masculine.
Right.
Is able to defile them because the knot goes into the heart and the stomach and is cast out, right? Thus, I think the final phrase should mean, thus the person purifying all foods, as in through the operations of digestion, the human body purges any food from impurity that has been acquired from another source. And I think this makes sense, for a number of reasons, but it makes sense. It doesn't force us to make some crazy postulate that like Mark is doing this like 36 word, he said, and then like 36 words, and then and then like a little parenthetical note at the end. Like there are just no example. I have never seen anyone give examples of this. Like they just say this is probably the case. It's a parenthetical comment, or it's modifying, he said, and I'm like, anywhere in Mark or any other literature. But at least I think my interpretation is more plausible because there are actually examples from the Septuagint of this, like this exact construction, where the implied agent in a certain scene, there's a participle at the end of a clause where the implied actor or the implied agent in a certain scene, even if they're not explicitly invoked as the subject of a verb, can be latched onto by the participle. And here you have twice the mention of the anthropos and the pronoun auphton to establish a viable subject of that participle.
That's awesome. Yeah. So basically, it's a continuation of the quote from Jesus. Is your suggestion?
Yeah.
And once he says, it enters not his heart but his stomach and is expelled, thus the person purifies all foods.
Yeah.
So that raises a question about what that means, though. What does it mean for the person to then purify the foods by the food going into his stomach and so forth? Can you kind of talk about that before we move on?
Yeah. So the key assumption here is that excrement, human waste, is impervious to impurity in Jewish law. This is a widespread assumption. Some people think the Qumran community, as evidence to the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Essenes, according to Josephus, thought differently. I actually have a long footnote questioning that reading. But what we do know is that, at least from Josephus, he assumes that most Jews would assume that defecating and human excrement cannot actually defile you in any way. You don't need to wash every time you go to the bathroom, right? Now, there are some prescriptions in Deuteronomy that say, you can't have human waste lying around in the camp, but it never says because it's impure.
Right.
And this is key because there are reasons for managing things other than just because they're impure, right? The rabbis, similarly, in the rabbinic tradition, no human waste, right, no human excrement can ever become unclean. And although they do regulate, right, if you're praying the Shema, don't be standing next to human waste. There's a few regulations like that, right? But they never say because it's impure, right? They just say because it's improper or something, right?
Right.
So if we assume this, right, if we assume, the evidence from the first century and well after it, right, all the way through rabbinic tradition and into modern Orthodox Judaism, human waste is not impure. Okay, well then presumably no matter anything you ate, no matter what it was, would become pure excrement, right?
Right.
So this raises a question, right? Well, okay, if the human body has the capacity to create pure objects, pure material, being human waste, from anything that goes into it, then how is it the case that anything that goes into you can defile you if you're eating it, right? Now, there are different ways to resolve this, but Jesus's argument is just, it can't, right? If the human body has the capacity to purify food, then food cannot make impure the body. No distinction, right? Now, this makes sense in Jewish law, right? If you have something that has a purifying effect on something else, that object isn't going to become impure, right? There's some weird things going on in the red heifer ritual, but it's not exactly the same, right? If I have running water and if I'm impure and I step into running water, the water isn't going to become impure. It makes me pure. And these things, impurity or purity is flowing in one direction. Either I get purified or I make the water impure, right? And the general ruling of the rabbis in Tosefta in Mishnah Mikvaot is the water purifies you and not vice versa. So similarly, right, the human body, if it creates pure excrement from anything that goes into it, well, then Jesus rules, well, then nothing that goes into you can defile you. Now, there's some people object to this by appealing to things like Ezekiel 4, and if you want to get into my reading of Ezekiel 4, you can read a long footnote in my paper about why that was the case. But again, it's one of those assumptions in Jewish law, right? You just assume in Jewish law that impurity is not impure. There are reasons for that, I think, probably because impurity language isn't mentioned in Deuteronomy, where that passage is about excrement, about not keeping excrement in the camp. Now, it's helpful to compare this to the rabbis. The rabbis say, right, similarly, the early rabbis say that, I mentioned this earlier, that where does the carcass of a permitted bird defile you? And they go, I might think it defiles in the stomach. No, it doesn't defile in the stomach. Okay, well then how does it defile, right? Now we have to kind of pause there. Wait, why did they say that? Why do they assume that it can't defile you in the stomach? Well, probably because they assume that the stomach has the capacity to purify anything that goes into it. Right. Now, so what they do is they then create a distinction between the stomach and the esophagus. And they go, okay, the esophagus doesn't have a purifying effect. So it must be the case that the carcass of a clean bird defiles when it's in your throat. By the time it gets to your stomach, it's already being purified. So, it's a no-go, right? Now, Jesus is different, that he does not distinguish between the esophagus and the stomach in terms of its purifying function in the digestive system. He just says, from the moment it goes in your mouth, it's being broken down, it's being created into excrement, and therefore, from the moment it goes in, it cannot defile you. And that probably leads him to read Leviticus 17:15 and 22:8 in the way that he must have, right? So there's an interesting different ways of resolving these, right? Putting scripture together, right? If I assume this from Deuteronomy about excrement, what does that mean about Leviticus 17:15? And if I assume a certain reading of Leviticus 17:15, then how do I, right? So again, scripture is not easy to put together. That's why people disagree about it. That's why we're having this freaking podcast right now, right? And so, right, these texts are very ambiguous and afford different interpretations. And Jesus represents one, if we're thinking historically, one among many Jewish ways of systematizing and putting together scripture, which is completely intelligible within first century Jewish reading practices and what happens later. And later reading practices as well. It's a debate and it's a position that's completely intelligible according to ways of thinking about ritual impurity and ways of thinking about scripture and ways of putting these things together. So basically Jesus' argument is, well, because it goes out into the sewer as excrement, which is pure, any food that's defiled that goes into you is purified, and therefore you cannot become impure through digestion. You cannot become impure by ingestion, because the body purifies, or the person purifies, all ritually defiled food through digestion. Right.
Well, that is so fascinating. I love the interpretation. I love everything you do with the verse, because it not only makes sense of the Greek grammar, how you translate it with the participle, and that final clause being a continuation of Jesus's words. That makes the most sense grammatically of the passage. But your interpretation of that passage aligns with a lot of what we see in these relevant texts from that period. And these debates that are going on. Whereas the antinomian interpretation, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. It grammatically, it doesn't make sense, as you explained, and the interpretation, the common interpretation, it just seems out of nowhere. It doesn't
contextually, it doesn't make sense. Jesus critiqued the Pharisees for disobedience, for setting aside the law of God, right?
Right.
Contextually, there's a really strong case that however we interpret it, it's definitely not the most popular version. That's like the one thing a lot of gospel scholars agree on now is like, well, we might have different kind of ways of resolving this, but it's definitely not just that. At least 715 is not just saying, just throwing out all food laws or whatever. Food laws. Yeah.
Right. Awesome. Well, I think your reading is definitely plausible. Not everyone agrees. There is a Christian apologist on YouTube named Arl Solberg, and he recently disputed this reading of the passage. He put out a video, and basically he made a couple of arguments. The two arguments that I kind of picked out of his video, I wanted to get your take on. But he rejects the idea that the context of this passage, we were speaking about the context earlier. He rejects the idea that the context of this passage should be limited to the question of ritual hand washing, which is the question that the Pharisees bring up at the beginning. Why don't your disciples wash according to the traditions of the elders? He says we should not limit it to that context, because Mark goes on to mention the commandments in verses 8-9, and that brings the Torah's food laws into the conversation. And so we can interpret what's going on here to be a broader discussion. Jesus is broadening the discussion, from the I'm trying to represent his view the best I can, but he's broadening the discussion from the ritual hand washing to the commandments of the Torah, and what he says therefore has implications regarding the Torah's food laws.
Yeah.
And so he also says in verse 19, thus he declared all foods clean. He just takes that, the common English translation there, and he says that this specifically targets the Torah's food laws. But how would you respond to this objection?
Yeah, so I think that there is an interpretation that goes something like this. The context is about, hand washing and ritual impurity. Therefore, any of Jesus' statements must be limited to that, and therefore the food in 719c, tabromata in Greek, must only refer in a limited sense to what's being discussed. That is food which is ritually defiled by unwashed hands. I agree that the context is about, of course, ritual purity, right? I disagree that with that kind of way of resolving the later verses. And let me explain. Even if we did not have anything about the context, right? Let's say we just had in Greek some saying. Jesus says, nothing that goes into a person is able to defile them. And then, because it enters into the heart, thus purifying all the food. Even if it were the case, still wouldn't undermine kashrut. Right now, I want to be specific. Not just food laws in general. There are lots of different kinds of laws about food all over the Torah, right? But tithes and what priests lay people can and cannot eat, right? So when I think one of the things that I get frustrated with, like mostly Protestant Christian interpreters of this, is they think that Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14 constitute all of the Torah's food laws, right? And so they just kind of mash them together. And I think this is part of the difficulty is there are different rules pertaining to different things, right? So Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14 are about prohibited and permitted animals. Even if we say we have no context, we have nothing about hand washing, right? The statement is nothing that goes into you can share its impurity with you. Okay. Well, animals in Leviticus 11, according to early Jewish interpretation, are not prohibited on a basis to transmit impurity. If that's the case, then even Jesus' statement on its own doesn't apply to Leviticus 11 and doesn't apply to Deuteronomy 14, because they did not understand the defilement language in that passage to be talking about the transmission of impurity from an animal to a human. That was not how early Jews understood that text. Now, someone might disagree, but that's the most historically likely assumption that Jesus would have had about the laws of kashrut, or what we now call the laws of kashrut. And then similarly, thus purifying all foods. Let me just also imagine a situation here, right? Which is a situation that's not imagined by Mark 7, but let's take the principle of Mark 7, 15 through 19, at least as I'm reading it. Let's imagine a scenario. Let's imagine that I eat pig, right? According to Jesus, that pig is going to be transformed by the stomach, and it's going to become ritually impure excrement, okay? It's still prohibited to eat.
Right.
Because even though that prohibited animal, or impure animal, meaning prohibited, is going to become ritually pure excrement, in the first place, again, the prohibited animals in Leviticus 11 are not prohibited on a basis to transmit impurity. So even though Jesus would say, hypothetically, if you said, well, Jesus, what if I ate a pig? He'd be like, oh, what are you talking about? Well, okay, I'm not talking about that, but yes, I guess it wouldn't be able to defile you. But early Jews weren't thinking that that's why they were prohibited. So it wouldn't matter, right? So even if you rip the context out, right? If you pay attention to the language of koinao, which means to share impurity, to cause something to share its impurity with the object, right? And you think about what's being said about katharizon, which is that it's becoming pure excrement, and you understand how early Jews were reading Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, and nothing changes. Right? Eating pig doesn't defile you anyways, right? Ritually. Right. So it's still wrong because God says so. There might be other reasons for why God did that, right? Which is what other Jews speculate, right? Why did God prohibit them? But not because they defile you, right? Ritually.
So basically, like, even if we read that into the passage, if we imagine a scenario, as you put it, where we're talking about pigs now as well. Jesus could still have said everything that he said exactly how he said it, and that still would not undermine.
It would be totally irrelevant, right? Because these are totally two different subdomains of law, right? One being prohibited animals, the other being ritual purity. But yeah, even if you permit that situation, nothing changes. And I think there's well, I think you had a second point you wanted to make actually about his response. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So he he talks about your interpretation of Mark 7:19, and
all right, yeah.
Yeah, so he kind of he doesn't really address it. He just jokingly calls it a crappy theory, But yeah, he didn't explain why it was wrong. I suspect, though, that he kind of finds ideas such as the stomach purifying food and the idea of excrement not being ritually impure, that kind of sounds strange. He makes a remark about, you using extra biblical texts, like, looking at Jewish literature and things like that. And it's like, well, none of that's in the Bible. So it's not really relevant. And this is just a crappy theory.
Love it.
We just throw it out. So, I wanted to hear your take on that.
So, I mean, I'll also say, I should have said this earlier, I'm really honored that people are even think this idea is worth disputing. So I feel flattered that this is a topic of discussion, even amongst people who disagree. So I'll add, I'll take a step back a bit and just talk about like method of interpretation. All of us are people who exist downstream of a lot of history. And we all exist in a reading culture that has been informed by centuries and millennia of interpretation, and that has transformed over time. And one of the things I, emphasize to my students, especially my first and second year students when I teach them, is you're going to be importing a lot of assumptions into the text that are not right. Importing assumptions into the text is not wrong, because we all have to have certain assumptions, right? We all have to assume a context. We all have to assume that this text that was written in a certain context made sense to people, right? And that means that you assume that your readers know the words that you're going to use, right? Like, so there's always a kind of an assumed encyclopedic knowledge of whenever someone says something or writes a text, right? And the danger of interpretation when there's 2,000 years and many miles in between where I am and also where you are, and where these texts and to whom these texts were written, is that we don't understand what the author thought was assumed, or what the author even just assumed themselves. So reading extra biblical texts, we have to be methodologically careful, right? It's not the case that any text from antiquity, we can just say this must have been assumed by Mark, right? We have to do careful work in reconstructing, right, what things would have been assumed, what things not, or what things were matters of dispute, right? And I've mentioned some of these already, right? But one of the things that these extra biblical texts help us see is that they help us see the plausibility of certain readings that we might think are counterintuitive. So if someone goes, wow, it seems so irrelevant that Jesus would say, or seems so silly that Jesus would say that, the stomach would purify foods and create pure excrement from it. It seems really convoluted, right? But then what we can do is we can go actually look at some other ancient texts that say like exactly this, right? So a good example, there are two texts in the Tosefta, which I bring up in the article. And they both say, I'm paraphrasing, there's a bit of ellipsis here, but they both say anything swallowed by human or an animal or a bird is pure. Anything swallowed by a human is pure. So they say if you eat, for example, if I'm outside of a house and I eat a dead body, if you bring it into a house, defiles everything that's under the roof. Okay, so this is like disastrous, right? What if I accidentally eat enough of a dead body that would make me impure, right? Or eat a dead body, and then I walk into a house. Does everything in that house become pure? And the Tosefta says, no, it doesn't. Because anything that's swallowed by a human is pure. If it comes out below, i.e. if it comes out as excrement, it's pure. The rabbis make exactly this same argument. And it even goes so far, my favorite is Bavli Menachot 69a, which is a later text, Amoraic text, which is hilarious, but it demonstrates the point. It's one of those texts where the rabbis are just kind of doing like theoretical legal gymnastics, but it's great. They say, okay, if an elephant swallowed an Egyptian wicker basket, okay, now the assumption is the wicker basket could have acquired impurity in some way, right? We assume the wicker basket because it's handled by Egyptians who are obviously don't know purity laws. Maybe a dead body touched it, whatever, right? We assume this basket's impure. What if the elephant poops it out and it hasn't been digested and it completely is still intact as a basket? What is the halacha? what is its legal status? Is it pure or is it impure? And the rabbis go, it's pure.
Huh.
Because it counts as excrement. Even though it's still intact, it counts as excrement. Because, drawing on the principle of the Tosefta, anything swallowed by human or animal or bird or whatever is pure. So now once we establish that this is a really early, Tosefta is much earlier than the Bavli, than the Babylonian Talmud, but it's a pretty early, it's a Tanaitic text. Within a few centuries of Jesus, recording rulings that are within a few centuries of Jesus, sometimes recording ideas that go all the way back to Jesus or even before him. If that's the case, well, then when we look at this potential argument of Jesus, we go, actually, it lends historical plausibility because we know that Jews around this period were making very similar points. Now, the Tosefta comes to different conclusions about what that entails about ritually defiled food, right? But the principle that nothing can defile you when it's in the stomach, and that anything that comes out below, i.e. anything that comes out as excrement is pure, is shared by the rabbinic tradition, broadly speaking. And so it lends historical credibility to the notion that this reading is plausible because it becomes contextually likely, right? It doesn't seem as far-fetched, right? If you are a Protestant evangelical, it's highly unlikely that you really can even state a single purity law from the Torah. I mean, I'm being a bit harsh, but I've seen this happen, right? Where my students coming from a kind of Protestant evangelical background say all these things about what Jesus must have, in touching a leper, he would have been breaking the law, right? And I'll just stop the class and be like, can anyone name me a single leprosy law? Right? And they can't. By and large, they can't. And so I think that we just have to have some intellectual humility, right? We being just in general readers that are far removed from this context, right? Not just Protestant, right? Not just talking about my students here, I'm talking about everyone who's far removed. We modern readers have to have some intellectual humility and some historical self-consciousness to admit that Mark wasn't writing to me, right? Mark wasn't writing with the assumptions that I had. Mark had a different kind of world encyclopedia, which is shared with, for example, knowledge of the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible is shared amongst us, somewhat amongst, the readers of early readers of Mark and later readers of Mark. But the world in which he inhabited was very different. And the assumptions that he had were very different. The assumptions about how to read Torah, and certain assumptions about purity and impurity, certain assumptions about how things would be interpreted, certain assumptions about what's important, what's not important, right? Modern Christian readers might seem like this debate is just too nuanced and irrelevant to be something that Jesus would say, right? Isn't Jesus saying nice things that always apply to my life? But actually, when you look at what's going on in the first century, you look at the kind of disputes over purity, you look at how people understood and engaged in halakhic reasoning, right, legal reasoning pertaining to the stomach and ritually defiled foods, how they made distinctions between what's in the Torah and what's in tradition. And then you go back and look at Mark 7, it all makes sense in that context. It becomes historically plausible. And so I think really I'm not saying that anyone who disagrees with me is, it lacks intellectual humility, right? That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that I think the assumption that we just can't pull from other texts does indicate a kind of lack of intellectual humility, right? I don't live in that world. And to inhabit that world, the best way for me to do that is to look at the available evidence, look at archaeology, look at texts, look at, try to reconstruct what people were saying and what people were debating, what people were disputing as best I can. And once I kind of swim in that world, then I start to see things in a different way. That is personally also my experience with one of the things that's motivated me to immerse myself in Jewish law is that my initial experience of it when I first started studying it with a professor was that it really started to make the New Testament come alive in just really new ways. And I started to see things in color, and I started to see things completely differently. And those things were just really exciting to read. And that has motivated, for me for years to dig into my Hebrew, dig into my Aramaic, to read the Talmud, to read the Tanaim, to read, Qumran and whatever. And the more I do that, the more the New Testament emerges in color and pops out in new ways and is it becomes so interesting and amazing in new ways. But of course, to others who are not familiar with that world, it may just seem like this is some kind of weird pet theory, right? But I think the question is essentially one of context and how we understand, and even, I mean, I just reflect theologically on this, right? Which is not really my practice, because I'm a New Testament scholar, so I don't talk about theology.
Right.
But I will for this moment, right? If God is in the business of speaking and communicating to people in intelligible language, right? Then if anyone has some kind of sense of that God is involved in the composition of these texts and in its transmission, then we should assume that these texts made sense in their context. It made sense to humans in their contexts and used human language that made sense to the people to whom it was written. And so in order to honor God's communicative condescension, I think that Christian interpreters should, by and large, accept and be motivated to digging into the historical context.
Amen.
And reading things that they're not familiar with and getting acquainted with a world that seems weird and strange to them, right? Because wouldn't it be dishonoring to the text to be like, oh, I just assume that this is some super historical thing that communicates equally to everyone at the same time? That functionally denies that God is in the business of making sense to people in their own context and using the language, human language and human encyclopedic knowledge to communicate, various things. That's pretty theological for me, and which is going public. So it's but I think if I'm speaking on the terms of this I forget his name, who's made this objection. I'm not just coming at it and saying, oh, Scripture is the reason why you need to do this with Scripture is a human document and it's historical, and you just need to you're just too Christian. I actually think it's theologically deficient to believe that you cannot and should not immerse yourself in extra biblical texts, not because everything they say is assumed to be correct or assumed to be assumed by Scripture, right? But because it helps you see the world in which Scripture was written and the world to which it was written. And
it's a window.
It comes alive.
Yeah, it's a window into that world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. Preach it, brother. I was like about to shout amen. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I think right there is a good spot to end it.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Williams, thank you so much for coming on and for joining me and for sharing your insights. I loved it. I know my audience is going to love hearing what you have to say about Mark 7. Before we end, where can people read your paper on Mark 7? What's the title of it?
Yeah.
And where can people read it?
Yeah, so it's called The Stomach Purifies All Foods, Jesus' Anatomical Argument in Mark 7:18 through 19. If you look up any part of that title and New Testament studies, it will come up. It's in the journal New Testament Studies, and thankfully, because due to my affiliation with the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, when the article was accepted, it's open access.
Awesome.
So it's free. So usually you have to pay inordinate amounts of money to get articles from this journal because capitalism or whatever. But this one's free. So thank you, Hebrew U. And you can all read it and download it for free. If you look up The Stomach Purifies All Foods and New Testament Studies, it should come up.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'll put the link in the description of this video so people can easily find that. What other projects are you working on at the moment? Now that you finished this paper, got it off your mind, what are some other things that you're looking into? Yeah,
so my current research project as the Kirby Lang Fellow at Aberdeen is on ritual and transformation in Judaism. So I'm writing a book about how different Jewish groups, including groups associated with the New Testament, understood the relationship between ritual and human transformation, and even something like we might call deification. And groups disagreed over how to prescribe certain rituals for what purposes. And so I'm looking at Qumran, Philo of Alexandria, the letters of Paul, and some later mystical literature called the Haggalot literature. that's my main project right now. I'm always doing other things, have my hands in made too many jars, as they say. So I'm writing on Romans 14 with my buddy Paul Sloan, and doing some more, like not antinomian food law kind of thing with that text, what's to be expected. And also kind of on the side beyond that, I'm inching towards a book on all of Mark 7. So cool. My experience basically when I gave this paper, it raised, people were like, well, what about this and this and this? And I tried to answer as much as I could in even the article's just about 19C, right? Like 5 categories of Barometer, right? 4 words, 13,500 words. I want to write a full kind of account of the whole passage, but that would take a book length treatment. So one day, it's not my primary project because I'm hired by Aberdeen to do this one project on ritual and transformation. So I'm doing that. But every once in a while, I have some thoughts and I blitz them down, and I'm inching towards a kind of book length treatment on that, which maybe you will see before I die. Maybe. Yeah,
that sounds awesome. Yeah, and I've heard a little bit about your take on Romans 14. I know that. It sounds really interesting. So, is there like a paper that y'all are publishing?
Yeah, so we gave a paper at what's called IBR, Institute for Biblical Research, which is a kind of adjacent meeting that happens in the same building at the same time as what's called Society of Biblical Literature in November, a big conference where a bunch of Bible nerds get together and say boring things and read papers, boring things, including myself. So we presented it there. We're going to present it again at the other meeting that's in November, the actual SBL, Society of Biblical Literature. It's a kind of an unwieldy paper because we have to deal with lots of various issues because the interpretation of that text is very fraught. But hopefully we can come up with something that's convincing. What's funny is that when we were kind of working on that text, we wanted to kind of say some things about it, and I was like, yeah, I mean, I want to be open to the possibility that this is just kind of saying like Sabbath and kashrut are just optional or whatever. And the more I dug into it, the more I was like, I actually don't think this is convincing. So I convinced myself out of my own reading, something that was at least a reading that I was really open to. So we're trying to get that down on paper and get the argument to make sense. There's just a lot of moving parts, and it's quite long. So that will be out hopefully somewhere someday, which you can link when it does come out, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, maybe we can have you back on to talk about it.
Oh, that'd be fun. Yeah.
All right. Well, if people would like to reach out to you or follow your work, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Yeah. So the most kind of social media thing I'm active on is Twitter. I'm not super active, but if you go to @LLLOGANNNNN, that's Logan with 3 L's and 5 N's. You can find me there. I have an aversion to using numbers in my handle, so I just repeat my own letters of my name, which is probably creates more problems than it solves. But probably more accessible is just my institutional email, which you can get by looking me up on the Aberdeen website. It's on there.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. Great. Yeah, I will throw some links down in the description to your Twitter and webpage and all of that.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think we will go ahead and end it here. Thank you again, Dr. Williams. It was a pleasure talking to you. And
it was really fun. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll have to have you back on again. All right. Take care.
Definitely. Thank you.